Hello and welcome to Ask an Apologist. My name is Matthew Middleberg, and I'm joined here by Mike Sherrard and Alicia Wood. We are all members of the Apologetics Inc. team, and we're here to discuss the question, what does the incarnation really mean? And around this Christmas season, this is a very relevant question, and so we've got some questions that we've prepared to discuss and topics to discuss. But we also want you to ask your questions. This is a place for you to address the things that are causing you to doubt, the things that are causing you to question. And so we want to hear from you. So go ahead and put those in the chat, put those in the comments, and we will do our best to address those, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook or on X, wherever you're watching this. Please put those questions in the comments and follow us on these different channels. So to set the stage on this topic, what we're really asking here is, what is the true meaning of Christmas? And this is a topic that's been addressed in many different media and movies, not the least being the VeggieTales movie, The Toy That Saved Christmas, right? What is the real meaning of Christmas? And so what we want to do is keep this fun and light, but also we're diving into the deep end of some theology. We're diving into some really interesting, fascinating topics about what it means to be God in human flesh and what Christians actually believe. And I think if you stick with us on this, you'll get clarity on what Christians actually believe and why they believe it, and hopefully you'll get your own questions answered as well. So to kick us off, let me just ask the question. Maybe I'll start with Mike on this. What in the
Can't you say
world does
I'm
this word?
halfway paying attention? Can't you see I'm only halfway paying
Oh no,
attention?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let me go to
Why?
Alicia because she is enraptured by my words here.
Right.
Uh,
Way to not
uh,
get a question, Mike. Thanks so
yeah,
much.
yeah. What does this mean? What's the incarnation? What does this even mean?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I guess we
Start
can.
start at ground zero.
I was gonna say, like, there's so many angles on that. Um, well, I think at the very surface level, what the incarnation describes essentially is this unique, I would say, unique in the sense of its meaning to Christianity idea that God actually becomes human, which isn't necessarily a completely foreign concept. But this idea that he becomes human to eventually end up sacrificing his life, it's the purpose part of it that I think is what's unique to Christianity. So God essentially becomes one of us, a being that is all powerful, that has always existed, takes on the characteristics of human beings and becomes a human being, born of a woman, as human beings are, and is raised, doesn't come out at 40 years old, but is raised as a baby, and it grows with learning and asking questions and doing things that humans do. Uh, but obviously, with a unique difference, a common thing that people say is that Jesus is 100% human, but also 100% man, or excuse me, 100% God. So 100% human, 100% God. There's this idea of there is definitely this idea that he doesn't somehow no longer um know about God. Like, it's not like one day he's saying, well, does God exist? Like, there's not like this lack of knowledge about who God is. He doesn't lose those parts of him
Mm.
and taking on um this different, you could say, entryway into encountering humanity. And so I think that's probably kind of just a general overview of what the incarnation is. It's, Christians aren't just trying to celebrate Jesus' birthday because he was a special person or that they really liked him, but it's actually a very meaningful thing that God, who chose to be, or who already was absent from a lot of the pains and things that we experience and deal with in this world, chooses to enter into it with the purpose to help redeem those that are hurting in the world. And so that's kind of a flyover of what you could say this is about, what this incarnation is.
That's great.
It's a really, really good article by Alistair McGrath. It's titled "Diving into the Darkness: C.S. Lewis on the Incarnation." And I came across this. I'd never read it before today. I came across this article and I was trying to find something else. I'd heard some folklore. There's a lot of folklore surrounding C.S. Lewis, or legend, or whatever you want to call it. But um, I had heard that Lewis, one of his stumbling blocks to Christianity was on the Incarnation, that he was moving towards theism, but one of his issues was on the Incarnation. And I was trying to find, because I was told that it was one of his Inkling brothers that helped him process the Incarnation. I couldn't find that. So if anybody listening in knows the reference that I'm talking to, let me know. But Lewis did write about the Incarnation in other ways, but I can't find that biographical piece that shows what kind of unlocked it for him. And I'm so tempted to read a good bit of this McGrath article. If it's not too nerdy, I think if you'll let me, I'll read just maybe the intro piece. It might be a minute and a half, but
Sure.
I think it would be
Yeah.
better than me just paraphrasing it, because I think it speaks to what is Christmas about and what does the Incarnation mean. And I think it might frame this conversation for us in an interesting way. McGrath writes, Christmas marks the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the central figure of the Christian faith. But why remember such an event? What has someone who lived long, long ago got to do with us today or with God? There seems to be a disconnection between the singular life of Jesus Christ and the universal relevance of God. At most, surely all that Christ can do is tell us something about God. That was a question that troubled C.S. Lewis. After a period as an atheist, Lewis had recently returned to belief in God. Believing in God, he concluded, was the best way of making sense of the world and of human experience, which appealed to both his reason and imagination. But Jesus of Nazareth did not seem to fit into this scheme of things. He seemed superfluous. Why did belief in God have anything to do with him? Lewis's thinking on this was given a new imaginative stimulus as a result of a long evening conversation with his colleague J.R.R. Tolkien in September of 1931. Lewis began to realize that Christianity was not primarily a set of ideas about God and the world. It was rather about a story, a grand narrative, which both captured the imagination and opened up new ways of thinking. The creeds arose from reflection on this true and trustworthy story, which centered and focused on Jesus Christ. When rightly understood, the imaginatively compelling story of the birth of Christ was about God entering into the world in order to redeem it. Lewis explored this theme in a remarkable sermon he gave at evening song at the Anglican Church of St. Jude on the Hill, Hampstead, on 15th April 1945, as the Second World War entered its final phase. To understand its imagery, we need to appreciate that Lewis had learned how to dive in 1930. Although he initially saw this simply as an enjoyable and exhilarating experience, he began to realize its potential as an analogy for what he was coming to see as a core theme of the Christian faith, the Incarnation. Lewis invited his audience to imagine a diver plunging deep into a pool of water to retrieve a lost precious object. As he goes deeper, the water changes from warm and sunlit to pitch black and freezing. Then, his lungs almost bursting, he goes down into the mud and slime before finally heading back to the surface triumphantly, bearing the lost object. And what is this lost yet precious object that merited this dangerous and difficult descent? It is human nature. God descended into his own universe and rose again, bringing human nature up with him. For Lewis, the doctrine of the Incarnation shows us that God dived down into the deep bottom of creation and came up again, bearing the whole redeemed nature on his shoulders. The exertion, even danger, faced by the diver is a mark of the value of what has fallen down through the deep water into the mud. Lewis invites us to think of a diving God who plunges into a dark and distant world to bring us home to where we really belong and where we really matter. It was a bit more than the introduction, but that's not even half of the essay. What do you think about how McGrath showcases what Lewis had to think about the incarnation?
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's really good. I was reading there's a passage, I believe it's in Miracles, where C.S. Lewis uses this analogy of sort of dying to self and rising again, and how he talks about the diver, he talks about all these analogies, and talks about how we see this principle over and over again. It's a principle of um yeah, you got to go down to come up. You've got to die to yourself to be reborn, to be renewed, and it's humility that leads to exaltation. And he says, all the ways that we experience that are just transpositions or reflections of the ways that Christ does that. That's the ultimate truth, is that, one of the most, I think he calls it the grandest miracle in all of Christianity, in all of the world, is that God became man, that he would humble himself in that way. Um, and that's what Philippians says about it, that Jesus Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So this just radical humility, this radical emptying of himself, for a purpose, not for no purpose, but for a very specific purpose of saving us. So yeah, I mean, C.S. Lewis has so many interesting things to say about the incarnation, as he does about most things. But yeah, I think this is a really, really helpful kind of starting point for us as we think about this topic.
So it's about the story of God entering the world in order to redeem it, to go into the deep and dark and cold places and reclaim something and bring
Mm,
it back and bring it into the light and let it become the fullness of what it can be. And I think there's something about the incarnation there that um, is about, this is going to sound crazy, but the glorification of man. I mean, part of what's wrapped up
mm,
in the gospel is that in Jesus Christ, not just do we have forgiveness of our sins, but we have the hope that we'll be transformed into the image of Christ, fully realizing that which we were made to be and the joy that comes along with it. And I think that's what Lewis McGrath was referencing, that Lewis was talking about, the reclaiming of human nature, that there's something about the incarnation that it's important in the sense that this is what leads to the sanctification and the glorification of humanity, not
mm,
simply the forgiveness of their sins.
mm,
And so I think that's what Lewis is trying to get out here. And part of the significance of the incarnation isn't just that we have a savior from sin, but we have a redeemer and one that will restore us to the fullness of what our humanity was intended to be, and experience the joy that can be had in fellowship with God as we live fully as what it means to be human. And I think that's a good bit of the significance of the incarnation, that much of the time it isn't spoken about. What do you guys think about that? Is that a crazy
yeah.
idea?
No, I
No,
think
yeah,
that's
no.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I think that it makes perfect sense. Even thinking back to what I was saying in the beginning about this idea that a God would come to Earth isn't really foreign. There's nothing that's not necessarily unique in that aspect, or that the gods would interact with humans. Like none of that is unique. But the idea that there is a purpose, that there is a redemption behind this all, that meaning is very unique to Christianity, and I think that is the part that does need to be emphasized, right? It's you think about this idea of, I always find it, not always, but when somebody raised it to my mind, I was like, this does make sense. We call the day of Jesus' crucifixion good. It's called Good Friday, and yet he dies, and it seems like that doesn't make any sense. Like he was just tortured, and you guys call it good, and
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, that's a fair critique, right? But there's this idea of that because of his death, there's so much good that now is resulting because of the sacrifice that he did, right? So the incarnation is tied in with the purpose and plan that that Jesus came for, right? He didn't, it says he talks about that he didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So he came to give his life, and that's why people can call it good uh, in the sense that nobody's rejoicing that he was tortured, and he even said, he didn't want to go through that, but just the idea that the sacrifice was big enough and important enough for him that he would come to earth, go through that pain to bring good to humanity. So yes, I think that all of that together, the incarnation is, God taking on flesh, but I think it's what it means that is what makes it so beautiful for Christians.
So why does Jesus have to become incarnate? I think this is a question that I've gotten before, and I'm sure you guys have too. If God is all powerful, if He's able to do anything, He says he doesn't want to die on the cross. He doesn't want to do these things. Why then does He do it? If Christianity is true, why does God do this?
There's something in that where Jesus then becomes the representative figure for all of humanity and
Hmm.
makes him a worthy sacrifice. The scripture talks about him becoming the last Adam, and it's
Hmm.
like a headship factor that he then becomes the representative of the entire human race, and his sacrifice thus is suitable for the human race. So I think there's that piece to it. But then there's also the element that Lewis was getting at, was that when in Jesus becoming man, we get both a vision and an understanding that our God knows us in our weakness, not propositionally, but experientially, which is remarkable to know that our God fully understands who we are. But then also in Jesus Christ, we have a vision and a hope of what restored humanity can become.
Hmm.
And it's just interesting that Lewis talks about here Christianity, that it's not simply a set of ideas and propositions about the world, but rather it's a story that we are invited to partake in. And again, in the incarnation, God becoming man, part of this story is not that we are just saved from our sin by our mighty Savior, but we are redeemed and restored unto the fullness of what we can be, and we can participate in this grand adventure that we are called to and get to participate, that partake of God's grace and goodness as we're sub creators over this entire earth. And so it's again the significance therein is both for the sacrifice that was a propitiation for our sins, but also a vision for what we are called to become and be, the fullness of humanity being transformed into the image of Christ. And that helps us set the path, knowing what we are saved for and called to,
Right.
not just delivered from.
Hmm.
No, that's so good. Yeah, I like how you added that save for piece in there as well. Wasn't thinking that direction. And I think when it comes to any kind of punishment, any kind of something has gone wrong. What can be done to make amends? There is a certain type of things that would be considered adequate, right? So, if so, for Jesus is dying for the sins of mankind. So, if God had sent a hedgehog to die, we would have said that just seems weird, right?
Hmm.
Like, how does a hedgehog do anything for the sins of mankind, right? It doesn't. There's like that doesn't even seem like that could even be a possibility. Like, it just seems odd, right? Because there is a certain type of uh you could say substitute that is or mediator that's going to be able to make the punish that's going to be able to be put in the place of the punishment. So you look at the Old Testament system, and the Old Testament was lambs, right? Lambs and goats, and they were killing animals. And the idea is that's not enough. Like, this alternate sacrifice, yes, at the end result, something did die. That itself is not enough. And so even in one of the reasons why they did the young ones is because this idea of that whatever that substitute needed to be had to be blameless. Okay, so you've got this idea of perfection being put in there. You've got this idea of this animal can't quite do it. So you need a human that's perfect, which none of us are, so that doesn't work. And we need this idea of human, because some hedgehog or lamb doesn't really seem to be able to be able to mediate or be enough to deal with the sins of humanity. So I think those are some of the things to consider as to why did he have to incarnate? Why did he incarnate? God could have sent something else, and nothing was going to be good enough that didn't fulfill this idea of the perfect human.
Hmm.
And human was key, therefore.
Yeah, that's good because there are several passages where it says, he had to do this. He had to die for the sins of many. And I think it's important for us to think about this question of why did he? And I like what you're saying there, Alicia. I've heard it said only only a man could represent us, but only God would have the resources to save us. So he
Yeah.
has to be man in order to be our substitute, to be our representative, but he has to be God in order to save us, in order to be able to have the moral perfection
Moral perfection.
necessary
Exactly.
to trade. So it's the best trade deal of all time,
Yeah.
right? We get Jesus's righteousness, he takes on our sin.
Yeah.
And that's why Jesus becoming incarnate is necessary. Going back to Lewis, I love what he said in response to one of the Russian cosmonauts that went to space and said, I went up there and I didn't see God, and so therefore God doesn't exist. And C.S. Lewis says, it's not like we wouldn't relate to God like a person on the first floor relates to a person on the second floor. It'd be more like Shakespeare relating to Hamlet. And in order for Hamlet to know who Shakespeare is and what he's like, Shakespeare has to write himself into the story. And that's what God does. He writes himself into the story. He allows us to experience him firsthand in this story of reality. And that is as how he chose to do it. Which I think is beautiful, and I think it's good, and I think we should rejoice in it. It's really good. So that brings up, I think, an objection. So let's talk about a hard question here. So we're saying that Jesus is God becoming man. He's taking on human flesh. But we're also saying that he's still God, right? But that brings up a problem. Doesn't it seem like God and man are just too different, right? Like we're just too different than each other for somebody to be both God and man. You could put it this way, like God is unlimited, human beings are limited, therefore God becoming man is impossible. How can somebody be both unlimited and limited at the same time? Seems like a lot of non-contradiction would preclude that. What would you guys say to something like that?
Framed that way, I get it, but I'm not sure what the contradiction is if a one person sharing two distinct natures, a divine nature and a human nature. I don't know what the contradiction is there. So I'm not sure that there is a logical contradiction in the notion of one person having two natures, divine and human. It's of course not common, but I'm not sure what, and it's not very comprehensible in
Mhm.
many ways. But I'm not quite clear that there is actually a logical contradiction there. Actually, I'm sure there's not, but I can't even.
Yeah. Well, and I believe there isn't either, but let's make sure we're addressing the question as best as we can. So let me give an example. So, uh, God has no weaknesses, right? He has no deficiencies.
Mhm.
He's only morally perfect. He's only perfect in every way. But human beings have weaknesses, right? Like Jesus got sleepy, he got hungry, he got tired, he needed all sorts of things. He has needs. um how can God, the unlimited one that has no needs, no weaknesses, have weaknesses and needs? How do those two go together?
Yeah, I think that passage you referenced in Philippians, where it talks about that though Jesus was in nature God, he did not. Um, I like a paraphrased translation of this rather than quoting it literally, because I think the best way to understand that verse is that Jesus did not consider his divinity something that he could exploit for selfish gain.
Hmm.
And I think what that shows us is that in this, um, Jesus having the divine and the human nature in his humanity, he would grow weak because that's what humans do. And Jesus did not use his divinity in an exploitive way of that situation, such that it would mean that he never really got to experience what the human experience was. And if that were the
Hmm.
case, he would not be a good high priest like Hebrews talks about us, because he would never have truly been tempted and experienced the weakness and the frailty of humanity. So I think a way to understand this is that Jesus having both a human and a divine nature, he never he never exploited his divine nature for selfish gain, but surrendered it willingly such that he would experience the fullness of what it is to be human. And that's necessary for the reasons that we'd talked about, thus being the perfect sacrifice, but also then in his role as being a faithful high priest that truly does understand us in our weakness and in our temptation.
Right. So I think the key part of this is understanding the two natures, that the two natures exist, right? So people will often say, well, if Jesus is God, then when Jesus died on the cross, God, like there's no more God. Like God didn't exist for those like 3 days he was dead type thing. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, so God is dead. So that doesn't make any sense. What happened to the world? How did the world keep spinning? Or, how did everything not fall apart without God overseeing everything or whatever? Right. So this is where the two divine natures piece I think is key, because you understand that the human part dies for sure, but God himself, God, like the supernatural being, this being that is beyond flesh, didn't somehow just cease existing for those 3 days,
Hmm.
and so this human aspect of him, yes, absolutely, I think it experienced weakness. I think it experienced all the things that we experience as humans. And I think, as Mike said, this is what also is, there's also a meaning in this. It seems like everything is like there's a point in a meeting tonight. Seems like what we're doing a lot of, right? The fact that he did take on those weaknesses and did do life as a human means that he can therefore then comfort us in anything we're going through, because he actually knows what it's like to be us. So it adds in that other aspect where he experienced all of the human things. And a lot of times people say things to me like, or I used to, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but they'll say, well, because Jesus, that means that God went to the bathroom. And I'm like, I didn't know going to the bathroom was like an evil thing. Wait a minute, hold on a second. Like, and so sometimes we think of things certain, like so much of humanness is foul, but there's actually so much humanness that is also good as well, that Jesus also went through with us, loves and relationships and friendships and laughing and certain things. And I mean, he also did those, tasting good food, and these aren't like, it's not like God didn't know what these things were before, but I'm just saying in every aspect of our humanity, Jesus partook. And so that aspect means that we are then talking to a God who actually knows and understands us. And not just in yeah, I know what it feels like to be you, but actually I was you. And so I think that when you understand it as two natures, which it is possible, complete, obviously, I'm guessing with Mike, it is possible that then I do believe it's true that there are two natures within Jesus. And I think we see aspects of that even in the world around us. So I think humans don't have two natures, right? But we do have this sense of being an essential being, but also being a person. Okay, so we are something that exists, but we're also a person. But if I was to pick up a pen, I could say it's got substance to it. It is a thing, just like I am a thing. I'm a being that exists, but there's no personhood to it, right? So there is a sense in which a pen doesn't have any kind of personhood. I have a personhood, so I'm already different than the pen, and God is just one more degree different than that. He's got two personhoods. And, well, not sorry, God has three personhoods. Excuse me. So this idea of Jesus being two parts, I think, human and divine, can make sense when we're talking about God exists in a form that is different than us.
Yeah, very, very well said. I think too, just thinking about, God being all powerful, I think it's actually a strength of his that he can choose to voluntarily give up certain things or limit certain things or limit his access to certain things. So it's almost like saying, well, adults don't crawl, right? Adults don't crawl. Well, unless an adult chooses to humble himself to crawl with a child,
Right.
to teach
Exactly.
that child how to crawl. So adults still can do those lower things, those things that they cease to do when they become adults. But it requires a humbling. It requires a limiting of their capabilities. It requires saying, you know what, I'm going to voluntarily choose not to exercise my ability to walk in this moment, and I'm going to crawl next to this child. Um, and I think there are different models, without going too deep into the weeds on this, to kind of uh, explain how Jesus can limit certain things. So, for example, God is omniscient, right? He knows everything. He is omnipresent. He's everywhere, right? So, is Jesus omniscient and is he omnipresent? Well, let's take the omniscience, for example. It seems like Jesus doesn't know some things. Like he says he doesn't know the day or the hour when God's going to return, right? Is that a problem for us? Well, there's ways of understanding that actually help us to kind of resolve that. So, for example, there are different models where you look at this as limiting awareness. So, for example, I know how to do algebra, but I'm not thinking about algebra right now until I brought up the subject. And so I have pre-conscious access to algebra, but I'm not actively exercising that. So Jesus has, let's call it this pre-conscious access to all the facts in the universe, but he chooses through his omnipotence, through his power, to limit it and to be able to experience exactly what we were talking about earlier of a real human life, what it's really like to be in that moment, to be in that state, to be growing, to learn all of the things that we experience. To actually experience those things, Jesus limits himself and limits his access to those things. And I think that helps to kind of resolve a lot of the questions and a lot of the problems that we think about when it comes to what it means for God to be in human flesh.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to put it, Matthew. That's really helpful. And I don't know why it's hard. It's when you put it that way, of course, or use that idea to explain it. I don't know why it's hard to think about God being able to do that. Um,
Mm.
and just real quick, I don't like how sloppy I was with the paraphrase when I referenced Philippians chapter 2.
Okay.
It's Philippians chapter 2, and in particular, verses 5 through 7. Let me just read it here real quick. It
Sure.
says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped." That's the phrase that it's difficult to translate fully what it means into English. But though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's where it's like he did not consider his divinity a thing to be held on to for his own advantage. And so
Mm,
that's where
mm,
we get into this
yeah,
limiting
yeah,
idea. And he did that, and he surrendered the right to fully exercise the fullness of his divinity to really kind of live a faux humanity,
mm,
a fake human life. And we're grateful for that because Jesus knows what suffering is. It's
mm,
interesting. He also knows experientially what moral growth is and how suffering
mm,
produces that. Again,
mm,
from a propositional standpoint, God understands moral growth perfectly, exactly how it works. But in his humanity, he knows what perseverance is. And so there is great hope in that, right? Because a lot of times when we face hardship, we don't understand the why. We do know part of the reason why we face hardship is because without it, moral growth is literally not possible. Jesus knows exactly what that process is like. And
mm.
so it's really comforting to, in the midst of hardship, when you will never have all the whys answered for you, you at least know my God knows every bit what I'm going through, and I can trust him in the midst of this. And without the incarnation, we would not have that hope, I don't think.
I wonder if, going back to that concept of equality with God being something to be grasped, or, Jesus said it's not. I wonder if part of our challenge with understanding the incarnation is that in our sinful nature, we would consider equality with God something to be grasped, right? Like if God
We'd exploit the
made me,
heck out of it.
yeah, if God gave me some sort of incredible power, I would be very reluctant to give that up. I'd be very reluctant to,
And I'd be like, I
kind of
don't
take this
care
on.
that.
Yeah,
That's right. Like, I don't care
yeah,
that I don't understand what you're going through. I ain't going to go through it myself.
yeah, yeah,
It's like
yeah.
that what is when you play those games and like, would you rather have, like, the ability to fly or, the ability to, stop
I'll
time or
take
whatever,
both, thank you, because I have
right?
divine power. Right? It's like that's what
Right?
we all would do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I guess one
So that
on this question though of, you know, God becoming man and the difficulty of that. One Muslim objection that I've heard specifically is that this would be too undignified for God. This would be too wouldn't that diminish God's glory? He'd be less of a person, less of a being, less worthy of worship by entering human condition, needing to be fed, needing to relieve himself, all of these things. How would you guys respond to that kind of concept?
I can appreciate where that is coming from. It's coming from a high reverence of a holy God that ought to be
Mm,
worshiped because he is the greatest of all things. I
mm,
can appreciate that. But I think a feature of the greatest of all beings is the ability to be weak. And that is beautiful. And to
mm,
take on, I mean, you think of someone of great nobility. When they would lessen themselves to go serve those lesser than them, that's not undignified. It shows the true strength of and the beauty of that individual.
mm,
So I think
mm,
and that's one of the things that I've come to know more and more as I've gotten older. I got to see it through my dad once before, or many times, but one particular instance where, a lot of times you think that strength must always be used, and if
mm,
it's not, then you're not really that strong. No, I've found that really, really strong people actually don't have to use their strength all the time. And it requires a ridiculous amount of strength to be weak or vulnerable or not seek things like vengeance because your dignity is on the line. So there's a kind of strength and beauty that is found in the lowering of yourself into what is viewed as undignified places. So again, I appreciate where that's coming from. The Muslim objection is that God is holy and is worthy of our worship, and He is. And one of the things that's part of God's nature is His love and His ability to descend to lower things, to love them well, and that is
mm,
because of His greatness. And
mm.
um, so that's I think that's how I would answer
Well,
that and
and
how I think about it.
Alicia, you've made this point before, about Jesus being able to do the greatest thing. If God cannot love us in the greatest way, why don't you say it? You know what I'm talking about, right? Of the self-sacrificial love.
Sure. So, yeah, I can definitely do that. But I wanted to it's interesting that how you like with this question being about you've heard this from Muslims.
Mm,
Because when I think about when I was mentioning, this idea of like, this idea that Jesus would go to the bathroom, like God would go to the bathroom, that's so bad. It would also come from Muslims. That's where I hear that from.
mhm,
And so I understand too why this question comes from them because of their view and idea of God and his interaction with them, right? And so they're using that into understanding they're using that lens through which they're understanding Christianity. So even within Islam, there's no guarantee that Allah will be in paradise, right? That even so, you may die and go to paradise doesn't mean you'll meet Allah, right? So there's a sense in which even there isn't a connection. But Christianity is the entire Christian narrative from Genesis to Revelation is about God desiring to be close to his people and making a way for that to happen. So Christianity is actually all about the reunification of and people that have turned their back on him and a pathway for them to be redeemed and go back to be united to him, because that's what God had always intended from the beginning, hence Adam and Eve in the garden and all these kind of things. So I think that idea is as I'm listening to this, it's like, I think the challenge and the reason why so many Muslims hold this view is because it's so beyond their framework to understand a lot of what Mike just said so well. I've heard humility defined as strength under control. Strength, yes. Strength under control. I think maybe I'm getting that wrong, but that's what I've heard it. This idea that you have something there that you are not enforcing, that you are not pushing out on somebody else for particular reasons. And
mm,
so I just think that idea of uh, and I would say this, trust me, one of the things that makes Christians makes their minds blown is that God would want to have anything to do with us. Like it's
mm,
something, one of the things that we are thankful for, that he would want to deal with me as a failure who can't quite get it right, who keeps messing this up. And yet it is still me that he loves and desires to be with. So going back to what you had said, Matthew, about I think we touched a little bit on this idea of the Trinity or this idea of Jesus having two natures, but when we recognize that some of the stuff is a little bit complicated to understand, but it demonstrates to me the perfection of God. I remember I was in a taxi with a Muslim taxi driver, and I said to him, the greatest way that anybody can show love is through or the greatest ethic is love that we can have for anybody. And the greatest way to show love is through sacrifice. And we
Mm.
that's not really anything difficult, or I think we recognize, I think every parent that's watching um would have felt at some point in their life like, I would die for my child, I'd give my life for my child. Or a parent whose child is sick in the hospital, and the parent is just saying, man, I just wish I had the cancer, not my child. Like this idea that you show love through giving of yourself isn't unusual. I think we see that kind of thing happen all the time. Um, and but what is interesting to me is that the Bible, Jesus. Oh, by the way, Jesus says the same thing, that no greater love does anybody have than they lay down their life for a friend.
Hmm.
No greater love does anybody have than lay down their life for a friend. So the greatest way to show love, even through Jesus' own words, is to lay down your life. And yet you see in Romans 5:8 something very interesting, where talks about how God demonstrates his love for us. And while we were sinners, Christ dies for us. So, and while we didn't want him, while we refused him, while we were living our own lives, while we want to do things our own way, Jesus dies for us. And that seems odd, because how does God demonstrate love for us by Jesus dying? That doesn't make sense. And so when you think about, like, it's like me saying, I want to show my love for Matthew, and so Mike, I need you to go outside and stand in the road and sacrifice your life by getting hit by a car. It's like, well, how in the world are you showing love for Matthew by having Mike do that? It doesn't make sense. If God, Jesus is just somebody that God has on earth here to die, then it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if I say, I want to show my love for Matthew, and the way I'm going to do that is by giving my life for him. In other words, if I'm going to show love, I have to be the one to do it. And so what you have in the incarnation is God being the one that shows love through self-sacrifice, which means that you have God, because Jesus is God. He is the one who's dying, and he is showing love, therefore, in the greatest possible way, by our own recognition of the greatest way to show love, which is self-sacrifice, and by Jesus' own words, which is self-sacrifice. And I shared this kind of with this Muslim, and I said, this is something that we're thinking about,
Hmm.
because if indeed I have a God who doesn't sacrifice his life, then that means I could give my life for Matthew, and I could have just done a greater good than God can do. Right?
Mm.
So the greatest way to show love is by self-sacrificing your own life. And if I sacrifice my life for Matthew, and I believe in a God who doesn't sacrifice, then I've just done a greater love, because I sacrifice and he doesn't.
Hmm.
So my question for my Muslim taxi driver is, how then is God good? If he cannot do the greatest good in the greatest possible way, how then is he good? And he didn't really have an answer, but I just encouraged him to think about it. Just to think about this. And so when we're looking at these topics of, that even if they seem like they don't really make sense, and Christianity seems like, how can this be that Jesus could have two natures, and that God has three persons, and all these kind of things, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you think this doesn't make any sense, and Christians talk way over my head. Understand that all these things weave together and are essential in demonstrating the perfection and the character and the nature of God. And I
Hmm.
think that they can't be overlooked. And this is, one more thing on this, and I'll shut up. But I was in Hawaii, I don't even know how many years ago now, 8 years ago maybe, and did an event with another former colleague of mine, Andy Bannister, and we were doing Q&A, and somebody asked in Q&A, at that time ISIS was doing a lot of terrible things, and somebody stood up and said, what would Jesus say to ISIS? And you're like, oh yeah, great. Who wants to answer that question? What would you? And so I think Andy actually was the one who answered that question, but I never forgot that question. And I remember thinking about that over the years. And I can't say for sure what Jesus would say to ISIS. I mean, I don't know. But I think that a possibility could be that if Jesus was to talk to ISIS, that he might say, you guys are giving your lives for a God who will never give his life for you. How
Wow.
then do you know that he loves you? How then do you know that your love for him isn't greater than his love for you? And I oftentimes think about that. Whenever I give my life for anybody, all I'm doing is matching the example that God has set for me. I'm never outdoing him. I'm never doing anything greater. I'm just meeting the standard, the example. Even as Mike had referenced earlier, he becomes the example for us. Jesus becomes the example of how to live as a human. Any
Hmm.
sacrifice I give is me just matching the perfect human model that I've been given.
Hmm. And Philippians 2 points that out. It's saying, humble yourself as Christ did. Have the same mind among yourself as Christ did. This humility. He is the founder and perfecter of our faith. So you're exactly right there.
So you think about, what does the incarnation mean? And it's obviously, as we've demonstrated, almost impossible to talk about the incarnation without talking about the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But you think about what a world would look like without the vision of that kind of sacrificial love.
Hmm.
Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. So here's this contrast, right? Rome in the first century had almost you could say literally all the power in the world. They perfected crucifixion to threaten their enemies and say, don't cross Rome or you will go to the cross. And that was the way the world was. And in many ways, you could probably argue that's the way the world always has been. You use your power to exploit others for your own ambition and gain and well-being. You
Mm-hmm.
don't consider anybody your equal. Power's all that matters. And in that world, Jesus, who literally he didn't just have all the power, he had all the power. He surrendered it for his enemies and went to the cross and died for them. I mean, that's as big of a contrast as you can imagine. And then what, though? He asked his followers to love like I have loved you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so Christians did. And it's not just us making that point. It's pretty common, at least in our circles at this point. The historian Tom Holland, who is, as far as I know, he's not yet he wouldn't call himself a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ in the way that we're talking about
I
faith
think
in
he is
Christ.
now. I think he's changed now. I saw an interview where somebody was
I'm
talking.
real curious. I'd love to see it. Send me that stuff, and
Yeah.
maybe afterwards we can put it in the details of this post. Because I check frequently on this because I want to know, and I haven't seen that yet. He grew up, I think it was Anglican, left the faith, considered himself an atheist, but then he points out that as a historian, when he's studying the ancient world, how barbaric it was, it became obvious to him that his moral sensibilities did not come from a place like Rome. So where did his moral sensibilities come from? And his conclusion was it came from Christianity, the
Yep.
Christian ethic rooted in sacrificial love demonstrated by Jesus Christ, or at least what his followers believed Jesus to have given for him, right? Changed the Western world. So it's, again, drawing the connection, it's hard to talk about the incarnation without the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But what would the world look like today without a vision of sacrificial love? Tom Holland says it would look like the barbaric world of the first century still.
Wow.
Mm. Yep. Yep.
It's really, really well said. We got a great comment here from Chris Gates, who says Philippians 2 shows the reversal of the fall in Christ. Philippians 2, Jesus, made in the likeness of humans, did not see equality with God as something to be grasped or exploited. In the garden, Adam, made in the likeness of God, saw that equality with God was something to be grasped, exploited.
Mhm.
Um, Man has been trying to exalt himself from the beginning. God has been humbling himself.
Love
So
it. It's
really,
great.
really, really well said. And this is a good reminder. If you guys have questions or things that you want to talk about, I hope you've been enjoying this conversation so far. But we would love to answer your questions, answer whatever you guys want to talk about. Let's talk about it. We've got a question here. I'm not sure. Maybe you guys can help me puzzle this out. Exactly what this means. But being as sacrifice can be a moral act committed by anyone. What makes Jesus's significantly unique? I think what he's saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why is Jesus's act different than anyone else's? Like,
Mhm.
why can't we sacrifice for each other? And there's actually a psalm that says this, Psalm 49, no one can redeem the life of another or give a God a ransom for them. The life for the ransom of life is costly, no payment is ever enough, so that they should live on forever and not see decay. So the death of a mere human being, one for another, can't atone. And I think just logically this makes sense too, right? Um, if I owe God a debt, I can't pay your debt, right? I have nothing to offer you. Um, and so it's the fact that Jesus is morally perfect. He lived a morally perfect life, and his life is of infinite value, that he is able uh, to save us by this atoning sacrifice, by giving his life, which he did not owe God, which he did not need to give up, but he gives it willingly. He sacrifices his life for us. He has the resources. He has the resources to be able to share with us. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that, but um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
it's a good
like
question.
I mean, I like where the question might be coming from, or it's interesting because on one hand, it's like, yeah, there's something about self-sacrifice that is common, whether it is Jesus doing it or us. There's things that are different though, right? Like the surrendering of divinity to be humble and sacrifice yourself for someone else. That's not the same. So there's something clearly different there, which would make Jesus's act significant. But there's also something in terms of efficacy that is significant. It's like,
Mhm.
this is a terrible example, but it's like, Gladiator 2 is out right now, right? And what, it's like in theory true that anybody could become like a substitute and stand in your place. But if the person that's going to be a substitute and stand in your place is a weakling that can't hold a sword, well, sure,
Yes.
he's doing the same kind of sacrificial act, but it's not going to be worth anything. It's
I
like,
like that. That works.
give me the big guy that can slay the guy that's about to kill me, not the puny guy here. So yeah, I mean, I get what he's saying. Like there is something in that the nature of the act. There's something of a moral equivalence, like it's the same, you're doing the same kind of act. Well, two things: one is the efficacy of the act is something that is significant to consider, but also then what we talked about earlier before, that there's something different between Jesus and us, and that would be the divinity that he's laying down freely for us. So but I like that question, I like where it's coming
Mhm.
from, and it's, to me, it's thoughtful and intriguing.
Yep. Thanks, Josh. Matthew, you're
Hey,
muted.
we lost you, Matthew.
There we go. A couple comments coming in here. Anna says that's so good, and she says oof, and this was all in
Okay.
response to Alicia. I think that's what we were all thinking when she was talking about the cab driver and stuff. So thank you for that.
Hi,
Um,
Anna.
yes, thank you for your questions and comments, Anna. And yeah, again, if you guys have questions that you want us to talk about, please put that in the chat. We would love to discuss them. So let me bring up another question here. Um, in the garden, right, Jesus asked that the cup would pass from him. So he's got this idea about the cup of suffering and this, like we said earlier, he's basically asking that he doesn't have to die for our sins. But then he says, "Not my will, but yours be done." So if Jesus is God, how can he want something different from God? Right? Can God's will be divided in that way? How do we think about that?
That's a good question, and I would like for the host who keeps asking all the hard questions to have to answer one first himself.
Sorry, my bad. Let me tackle this one. Let me jump in on this one. So yeah, I think we can say that even in our own way, right? We can have multiple layers to our will. So for example, a parent can want their child to be successful, right? But also want them to be independent. And so in one sense, yes, they want them to be successful so they could come in and they could fix all their problems and they could try to, do everything. But their higher will is that they would be independent. So they allow them to make mistakes. They allow them to learn from those mistakes. They allow them to grow and to do all sorts of things. So theologians have talked about, different kinds of God's will and different ways of thinking about that. We could also but even in the prayer, right? Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours be done." And so even in the prayer, he's not saying, uh, "God, this is what I want, give it to me." He's saying, "I have this desire, but this higher desire." And so he's even in the prayer saying, "Your will be done." Not this feeling that I have, not this desire that I have. Your will be done. And I think we should expect that, Jesus has all sorts of desires that God in his essential nature does not have, right? Jesus gets hungry, so he has the desire for food. Well, the eternal God has no need of food. There's psalms that talk about, does the God of all mankind need food? No, he does not need a man to feed him, right? But Jesus does, because Jesus takes on, again, this voluntarily. He takes on these weaknesses of humanity. So, yeah, I don't think that's a contradiction that proves that Jesus is not God or anything like that. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I
No,
think.
you're right. I mean, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I think too. I think what I take into consideration is Jesus's emotional and mental state at that time. And so I don't think of it so much as somehow it's a contradiction between him being God and him not being God. Rather, I think what you're seeing, and you, when you read the story of the garden, he knew exactly what was going to happen if he was going to go to that cross. He knew the pain, the humiliation, the shame, the parading around, the torturous way in which he was going to die. And he knew that it was going to be so much that he let alone to what extent. I mean, when he was on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? So whatever that anguish, that level of deep despair, we know that that's what he was experiencing in the garden as well. That's why he
Mm,
had that. He says that he was sweating blood. So hemoto,
mm,
the word is that where he was under such duress that he was sweating blood. And so I think what you're seeing is the very human aspect of Jesus, knowing at the same time that he says, "I've come to give my life as ransom for many," and at the same time knowing I'm about to be tortured. And I wish that there was some other way that I could ransom humanity. But I know
mm,
full well that unless the blood is shed, unless I die as the only being who can do this, because like things we said, because I lived a perfect life, because I also am human, that knowing that I'm the only one to do this, this is going to be horrible. And so I
mm,
think holding those two things, knowing why I'm here and what I intend to do, but also knowing that there is no other way and that this is going to hurt. I don't see that at all as a contradiction, but rather having the full picture and the full realization of what something is going to be. I mean, this happens all the time, right? You may not like getting vaccines or getting a shot, and you're driving to the doctor's office and your heart's racing a little bit, like, oh, I don't want to get this vaccine because it's going to hurt. But you're still driving there. Like, you're still doing it, but you're also like, does that make you any less human or any less of a person because you're going through certain experiences? No. It's just that you're aware of what's to come, and that is triggering this emotional and mental response within you. So I think what you're seeing is the very human part of Jesus, and him responding to this this sacrifice that he is choosing to do. Because people will say to me, "Well, why would God, send his son? That's infanticide." I'm like, hello. When you read the biblical text, Jesus is actually saying,
mm,
"I come to do this." And so that's very different than sending somebody else. Self-sacrifice is a very different thing. But so I think what you're just seeing there is that tension and that wrestling. And I actually, getting back to things we've said before, that's the human part of him, that when I'm stressing, and I mean, yeah, when I'm stressing and I'm nervous, I'm like, or something's really bothering me and my heart's racing. It's like he gets it. He's been through even worse situations than even what I'm stressing about.
mm. And I think that goes back
Uh,
to what you're saying, Mike, of just the comforting nature of realizing that Christ has not only done something which accomplishes our legal satisfaction before God, although he has done that, but he has experienced personally what it means to go through the kinds of things that we go through in our life. And scripture even says that, he suffered in every way as us, yet without sin. And so he knows what it feels like to be anxious, to be worried, to feel the kinds of things that we feel. And knowing that is comforting. It's comforting to us.
I'm I'm half listening to Alicia, and I'm just stuck on this because I pulled up Matthew 26, where this is what you were referencing. And the first instance in verse 39, it says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." So yeah, I did. I mean, I heard enough of Alicia to talk about the humanity of Jesus here and him understanding what he was about to have to endure. The second time he says it, there's something about the phrasing of it that's like uh, it causes like an inspiring ache. He says, where is it? Verse 42. "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it." I don't know. There's something in that phrasing of it that's just it describes a man who knows what he is going to endure and he's going to drink it all. He's going to take it all. So it's not I just yeah, I don't know. The two together, I don't know, for whatever reason, it's just hit me. It's also bringing to my mind something Nietzsche wrote, and it's slightly different, but Nietzsche in his parable of the madman, where he's mocking atheists for their hubris and their pride, thinking, you're celebrating God's death. You have no idea what you've done. You've just unchained the earth from the sun. Nietzsche, of course, didn't think God existed, and this should happen. He was just mocking the naivety of those that failed to realize the consequences of what this will do. But he goes in and he says, like the madman says, how will we ever drink up the sea? And it's hard to know exactly what he means there. He's kind of being poetic and trying to just describe the cataclysmic nature of this. But he also talks about later things like the notion of atonement. And in the parable of the madman, Nietzsche recognizes that humans aren't going to stop feeling guilty. How are they going to atone themselves for their sins? And it's like there's something there that's like, are you big enough to drink up the sea? Are you big enough to be able to take the fullness of what atonement means? And Nietzsche, of course, is thinking about it just for one's individual psychological state, not the reality of one person taking upon them the literal sins of the entire world to atone for them. And so there's something in there that it's like if Jesus saying, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, all right, I'll drink it. And isn't that what you want to be as a man, Matthew? I mean, good grief. And it's not just simply a masculine thing, right? I expect my daughters to live in the same kind of way, right? But reading things like that, aren't you just inspired to want to be like Jesus? In a moment like that, says, all right, fine. Okay, that's a bad way to do it. This sounds like a defiant thing, but it's like I'll drink it.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly inspiring, if that's not too poor of a word to use to describe it.
No, it is. It is just reflecting on this, not just philosophically, but theologically, but even just pastorally, or looking to the scriptures for inspiration and thinking about what Jesus did for us. Um, that's why Philippians 2 can say, "Have this mind amongst yourselves that is the same as Christ Jesus." Have this mindset to consider others more significant than yourselves, to put their needs first, because that's what God did for you. It's like what you were saying earlier, Alicia. He's not asking us to do anything that he's not willing to do himself. In fact, nothing that he didn't do himself. He has died for us. He has humbled himself. I mean, the God of the universe is born as a baby in a manger, in a food trough. I mean, that is we grow numb to how unbelievable that is, and how incredible that is. I mean, you just I think of, silly examples like the greatest athlete in the world chooses to, you know, uh, dress up in a children's costume and go to a children's hospital. Like when we see something like that, where somebody that we consider to be great humbling themselves, we see how beautiful that is. We see how good that is, and it inspires us to be undignified in ways that are for the benefit of others. And yet God does this to an infinite degree. He takes on human flesh for us, which is just, it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. It's great. Josh has a lot of good comments and questions here. Let me take one more of these here. He says, to what Jesus said in John 10:18, could Jesus have said and done this if he weren't God incarnate? John 10:18 saying, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down, my life, of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So I think that's, you're exactly right about that. Jesus has the authority to lay down his life and to take it back up again, and he has the authority to do all sorts of things that he says in scriptures. Right? These are some of the reasons that we are so confident that Jesus is God incarnate. Is because, not only because of these passages that talk about him. I mean, obviously, I think John 1:1, right? Or John, the word was with God, and the word was God, and the word uh, 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 took on human flesh and dwelt among us. These passages point towards Jesus's divinity, but also just the things that Jesus said he could do, the things that he said he would do, judging the world, right? Throughout all of the Old Testament, who is the judge of the world? It's God. It's Yahweh. He is the judge of the world, and yet Jesus says, "I am the judge of the world." And so he says all sorts of things. He says he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He says that he has the authority to forgive sins, right? To forgive sins. Wait a second. How can I forgive something that two people that are not related to me have done wrong to each other? How can I do that unless Jesus is God himself, the one that against whom all these offenses are ultimately due? It's only if he's God that he can forgive. And the religious leaders right there, they recognize exactly what Jesus is saying, and that's why they immediately are saying, oh, he's blasphemous. He's claiming to be God, and yet he wasn't blasphemous. He was actually God. So yeah, there's so many different reasons and arguments, and then part of the reason where maybe you sense some of the passion coming from me on this, and from all of us kind of arguing for the deity of Christ, is that there are people that challenge this and try to say that Jesus isn't God, that he is just some sort of exalted man, or that he has some sort of exalted status, or he was a prophet, or he was a good teacher or a good leader. But going again back to good old C.S. Lewis, he's like, Jesus didn't leave that option open to us, right? He never intended to leave us the option of him just being a good teacher or a good prophet or a good man, right? Because the kind of man who claimed the sorts of things that he claimed would not be a good man unless he were God, right? If he's making these incredible claims and he's not God, then he's not a good man. He's not a good teacher. He's not a good prophet, right? And yet we all recognize that Jesus is this moral exemplar. He's this person that we look up to, this person that we revere. And I think it's because he is who he claims to be. He really is God incarnate in human flesh. Well, sorry, I didn't have a good follow-up to that. But
That seemed like something that didn't need commentary. That was nice.
thank you. Missy Thomas says, highly recommend On the Incarnation by Athanasius. Very joy-filled and hopeful. Thank you for that. Actually, C.S. Lewis wrote an introduction to that as well, which is, I think, part of what we pulled from tonight is from that introduction as well. Thank you, Brandon, for your amen there.
Hi, Brandon.
Yeah. Great. Well, do you guys have anything else that you would like to address tonight with this topic of the incarnation, or go back over, or if anybody has a question or a comment that you'd like to suggest, now is your last chance to get it in before we conclude the night, and move on.
There's something about the incarnation that is best understood through imagination and wonder, not just facts and propositions. I think that's what Lewis is getting at. Christianity is just not a set of facts to be learned. It it's more than that. It includes that, but it is more than that. And when it comes to the incarnation, these matter of fact, kind of factual questions or philosophical questions that we ask, like we talked about tonight, are certainly appropriate. They're fair game and they should be asked and they should have thoughtful answers to the best that we can. But during Christmas, um, let's be good at the wondering about this and the great story that it is that a loving, good God who made all things came to this world to redeem that which was lost and broken and restore it to the fullness of what it was created to be. I mean, there's just a great story there. And it's what we're part of. And during the holidays, it's good to spend time in wonder and awe, not just cold rationality. And of course, we say this as figures of Apologetics Inc. And there's a time and a place for all things, and rationality isn't the only way to apprehend the fullness of what is reality. It's a part, it's a helpful part, it's a needed part, but so also is imagination. And so let this story captivate your imagination this Christmas season, and may it result in worship, peace, and joy.
Really well said. And I think one way to kind of experience the story in a really powerful way is by reflecting on these theological questions, these theological topics, meditating on the nature of Christ, meditating on what it would mean for him to be in human flesh, and these sorts of questions, but also just through the carols and songs, which brings up Anna's question here, a very important question. During which Christmas carol do each of you experience the Holy Spirit the most? If it's not O Holy Night, then I'd have to doubt your faith. Thankfully, Anna, I will agree to you. O Holy Night is my favorite Christmas carol, and I think it is because it actually does really draw my faith out, and I just experience the powerful idea of oh holy night, and this fall on your knees. I'm forgetting the lyrics now as I'm not singing it. I'm
I
trying to
know, it's
remember
always
it
hard when you don't
talking.
sing it.
uh yeah, yeah,
Hear the
anyway, but
angels,
when
yeah.
I'm yeah, hear the angels sing. Yeah, it's powerful. It's very powerful. I know my dad's favorite is "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," and the lyrics of that are really really powerful as well. How about
Yeah.
you guys? Do you have any of these that you like?
Go ahead,
Mike?
Alicia.
Oh.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to top "Oh Holy
Thank
Night."
you.
And what I love about that too is the song structure, not just the lyrics. That hitting the minor chord in that fall on your knees. I mean, it's like it digs you in. It's one of these things where the lyrics and the music, they're like working in tandem to almost like force your body into the posture that the lyrics are calling you into. And just the way that the song is written from the lyrical standpoint is it reinforces that deep longing. And it's like this but it's a hope filled longing. It's not a desperate longing or a a despairing kind of longing. It's a hope filled longing. And so there's something about the chord progression, the use of the minor note in there, and the fall on your knees, where it's just like it just elicits like a complete outpouring of your soul in that song. And I think it's why, Anna, you're right that it's the best, and those that don't think so don't have the
Mm,
Holy Spirit,
mm,
or
mm.
however you put it.
That is hilarious. You just didn't want Anna to doubt your faith. That's what it was. No, you could tell Mikey's a musician.
Well, when
Yeah.
we didn't do a ton because I played in a band for years, and we didn't do many covers, and it was rare that we did Christmas music. And
Mm,
um, but my favorite song ever playing was "Oh Holy Night" for the reasons
Oh.
I just
mm,
talked about.
mm.
I mean, I think "Oh Holy Night" is a lot of people's favorite, so I can't argue with that one. Um, I love playing it. We played it last year, one of our Christmas shows. We did it. It was beautiful. Um, and I will add, on, Anna. One that I stumbled across. I don't remember how I found it. I think I stumbled across it really. Like I popped up on the YouTube as YouTube flips through songs. It's called "See Amidst." No, actually, sorry. I think I asked people on social media a couple of years ago, "What's your favorite Christmas carol?" And somebody said, See amid the winter snow." And I'm like, "What is that? I've never even heard of that one." And so then I put it on YouTube, and you need to listen to it. Listen to the Dan Forrest version. Dan Forrest is a choral arranger, so he makes things for like more choral type sound. And if you listen to the Dan Forrest "See Amid the Winter Snow," it's beautiful. Let me just read you some of the lyrics. It says, "See amid the winter snow, born for us on earth below. See the tender lamb appears, promised from eternal years." And the chorus is, "Hail thou ever blessed morn, hail redemption's happy dawn. Sing through all Jerusalem, Christ is born in Bethlehem." And the second verse is, "Lo within a manger lies he who built the starry skies. He who throned in height sublime sits amid the cherubim. Say, ye holy shepherds, say, what's your joyful news today? Wherefore have you left your sheep on the lonely mountain steep?" And it goes on and on, and I won't read you all of them. And the last one is, teach us, holy child, by thy face so meek and mild, teach us to resemble thee in thy sweet humility. And so you see, I think just a really beautiful picture of, obviously, the one who built the starry skies coming here to earth. But also, when you listen to the Dan Forrest version, it's just beautiful. So,
Hmm.
I do also like "Joy to the World." It seems like
Yeah.
maybe too cliche and easy of a choice, but the lyrics are really just really good, and I like them all. But towards the end, where it says, "He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness." Oh, I missed that. What was it? Why y'all?
sorry.
Partial faith credit, Alicia. Nice. That's great.
That's funny.
I love it.
I
Thank
love the line, but at the end there, I love the "He rules the world with truth and grace," but I particularly like this, "and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness." Makes the
Mhm.
nations prove the glories of his righteousness. So it's, speaking to the sovereignty of God, it reminds me of in Acts where Peter is quoting, I forget where he's quoting, it's in the Old Testament, but he's talking about why do the nations rage? Um, they're only doing what God has preordained they would do.
Mm.
And so why do the nations rage and plot and scheme? That's what Peter is saying in his sermon. He's referencing, he's quoting the Old Testament. Because all of their plotting and scheming and raging against God, what does it accomplish? Simply what the Lord's will is. And so just in this song right here, it makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness, where it shows in the end the Lord is sovereign and in control, and his will be done.
Great. It reminds me of I can't remember if it was Peter Kreeft or maybe it was Alvin Plantinga, but when he was giving a bunch of different arguments for God's existence, and one of them was, I can't remember if it was Beethoven's Fifth or something like that, but it was one of those great symphonies, and it was like, this is an argument for the existence of God. You either get this or you don't. And it was like, okay, it's a good point, When you listen to great works of music, great works of beauty, great works of art, it just calls out an explanation for that greatness. What is sort of being transposed into the art here that is calling us up and higher, and yeah, it's really powerful.
Hmm.
Great. Well, we thank you so much, everyone, for joining tonight and for asking all of these excellent questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get the chance to go through all of them tonight. Josh, thank you for all of your questions, and for everyone else, Anna, for your questions about the carols, which was probably the most significant discussion of the night. But yes, we really appreciate all of you and your viewership. And if you have not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do that. Follow us on X or on Facebook. and we will see you. We do this every month. We do an Ask an Apologist, and it's a different topic every month. So feel free to follow us so that you can join in for the next one, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much. Merry Christmas, everybody.